Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Aniegolu. Now, it's called the October Surprise, an event in the final month of the US presidential election which turns the race on its head. But the news that President Trump has tested positive for the coronavirus arguably has even wider implications. The leader of the world's most powerful country is in a high-risk category. He's in his 70s and was classified as obese at his last health check. Financial markets around the world fell after the president tweeted that he and his wife Melania had coronavirus. Mr. Trump had earlier told Fox News he was going into quarantine after his advisor Hope Hicks, who traveled with him on Air Force One, had tested positive herself.
All depends upon the infecting dose to begin with. So, was he given a large infecting dose, then leads to rapid development of illness and then progresses very quickly to severe illness? Time will tell. But having said that, a 74-year-old person who gets infected can, in some circumstances, go on to develop severe illness, and their mortality is also higher. It's very much a bit like Prime Minister Johnson in the United Kingdom when he got the infection. You can be ill, you can progress to being severely ill, progress to being in hospital, progress to requiring oxygen support, and in some cases you progress to requiring a ventilator. Only time will tell. It is very important that although the President of the United States of America has been diagnosed as a case now, we keep to normal protocols. It is very important not to deviate and start making exceptions, because that's where you start making mistakes. So you should follow normal procedure for what would you do if there was a case which was a contact of yours.
Well, for a further medical assessment, I'm joined now in the studio by Dr. Cyril Erameh, a consultant physician and neurologist who works at the This Day Dome COVID Isolation Center here in Abuja and who has been managing COVID patients for the last 4 months. Thank you very much indeed for coming in.
Yeah.
Statistically, globally, how have men who are the president's age of 74 fared with the coronavirus? Because from what I've heard, globally, it's thought that 1 in 25 people of that age who are infected with the coronavirus will die. So age by far and above the biggest risk factor, is that right?
Yes, it's very true. So for ages above 60, based on the studies that have been conducted, observational studies, because the virus is still evolving, so you can't make deductions completely at this point. But from observations, it has been noted that persons above 60 have a higher risk of dying from the disease.
But of course, you can compare two 72-year-olds, and one of them will be in incredible health, and the other one could already be in a care home needing a huge amount of support to stay alive.
Yes, exactly. So for such a patient who needs a lot of support to stay alive, the risk becomes higher. So it's also been noted by observational studies that patients that have comorbidities like hypertension, obesity, that's a BMI greater than 30%, and 30 greater than 30, and then people that have diabetes mellitus, and those with chronic kidney disease, and patients that have chronic pulmonary diseases are also at a higher risk of dying with this disease. So for 70-something-year-old persons, where one doesn't have so many comorbidities and one has those comorbidities, the person with a higher comorbidity has a higher chance.
So it really depends on the health of the person.
Yes.
I mean, it's not a blanket thing that if you're 74 years old, you're likely to, be more likely to die. I mean, it could be if you're 74 years old and you have these problems and your health is not very good, then your chances of being affected more is higher.
Yes. So if you're 74 and then you have these comorbidities, and then you're 74, you don't have the comorbidities, so the person who has these comorbidities has a higher chance of dying. So,
okay, but of course President Trump doesn't drink. He claims to be in super health. but he's overweight and classified as obese. How much of a risk is that?
So obesity is one of the risk factors for poorer outcome with COVID-19. So though sometimes obesity is said to be a poor outcome measure because it also predisposes you to other cardiovascular diseases like hypertension and diabetes mellitus, which may worsen your outcome if you become positive for COVID-19.
And of course, obesity is measured depending on your height, your that's it, is it? Your height, your age, all that sort of thing.
So it's measured according to your weight in kilograms and then your height in meters.
Right, because if you're a certain height, then you're expected to be a certain weight, not to be obese.
Yes.
President Trump is quite tall, though.
He's quite tall, but in recently, following some medicals, it was established based on his weight and his height that he was outside the normal weight range and in the obesity range.
It's interesting that we don't have any description of President Trump being ill, even though he's tested positive for the virus. I mean, we haven't heard of him showing any symptoms. So he has coronavirus, but we don't know if he's got COVID-19. Can you explain the difference and how this works to us?
So yes, for the disease, patients could present without symptoms or very mild symptoms. So you could be positive with the virus and not show the illness. So at this point, from what we have as information, that's what it is for him. Though it could progress as it goes. But again, a large percentage of people are grouped into the asymptomatic and mild cases. About 81% from a large Chinese study of over 72,000 persons, show that 81% of those people have mild asymptomatic and mild disease and recover. Just about 10 to 15% we have severe disease, and then 5%, a little below 5%, we have critical illness, and then about 2% we have fatal disease, which rapidly progress. So, but then again, that 20% that get more ill also are people above 60 and people with those comorbidities.
So basically, however you look at it, he is in a higher risk category.
Yes, he is. So he needs to be watched carefully.
Right. And the disease can get progressively bad, doesn't it? Because when, for example, I mean, I was talking about that with the Republican strategist that I was speaking to earlier, when the British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, was admitted, he was exhibiting virtually no symptoms. And then as he stayed in hospital, it got worse. And then he eventually went into the ICU. So it can be progressive, can it?
Yes, the disease can be progressive. So it can start without symptoms, and then the body tries to respond to the virus, and that's where the main pathogenesis of this disease comes about. So it's called a cytokine storm. So it is your own body immunity trying to fight the virus, and then some collateral damage. So that collateral damage can cause worsening symptoms later as the disease progresses. So being just positive and no symptom doesn't mean just sit back. So you need to be in an isolation center and then or isolated at home and watched carefully.
So what's the I mean, in terms of proven treatments, what sort of treatment will be potentially available to the president in the circumstances?
Well, it's dicey talking about treatment at this point. As I earlier mentioned, the disease is evolving. So according to...
Yeah, but just give us a sense of the range of treatments.
Okay, yes. From WHO, the World Health Organization, there's no specific treatment, but treatments have been tried. So, and there is no vaccine now but they are all under clinical trials. So drugs that have been tried popularly, hydroxychloroquine. The Australians have tried ivermectin. We have tried using that too in Nigeria. We use that in our isolation center. Then they have also tried the antiviral drug called remdesivir and lopinavir. Also, some people have tried using convalescent serum from patients that have very high antibody titers following the illness. Yeah.
So does it depend on, I mean, you're a doctor, you see these people
Yes.
every day. Does it depend on the symptoms that someone is exhibiting? In other words, if somebody comes back and is pretty bad, do you say, okay, in the pecking order of drugs that are available, I'm going to give you this one because this is much stronger than the other one? I mean, how do you make that determination?
Okay, yes. So for patients that mild symptoms, usually just try giving the initial drugs of hydroxychloroquine. But when we see severe symptoms, we try to use the antiviral remdesivir, which had some proven effect in reducing the viral load. And then we also manage symptomatically with antibiotics if they have started to have cough and difficulty in breathing. Oxygen too can be used, and also recently steroid therapy if they start to have difficulty in breathing, and that has proven to help ill patients. But we won't start that for mild patients. So mild patients, we might just watch them on multivitamins and maybe chloroquine, hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin.
Right. So if someone were to be diagnosed with COVID-19, what would be the first thing that you would do in the hospital if they came to you?
So the first thing I'll do would be to find out if they have, we'll find out the kind of symptoms they have.
Right.
And if they have symptoms of more severe disease. So we usually try to look at their oxygen saturation. So we use a device called the pulse oximeter to check. So if your oxygen saturation is less than 90, that's when we get very worried. But if it's above 90, close to 100, we usually just give, for us, we give ivermectin in my own center. So we use ivermectin and dose them for 5 days and give them vitamin C, vitamin D, zinc, and then we just keep watching them and isolate them.
Right, and obviously you're not in the White House with the president, but I mean, in the context of what we've just heard, him catching this disease, given your experience, how would this normally, for somebody that age, for somebody who's been diagnosed, how would this affect his ability to work? I suppose it depends on the severity, doesn't it?
Yeah, it depends on the severity. If he has just mild symptoms or no symptoms, it might not really affect how much he can work. He can work from a room, he can be isolated in the house, but he can still work maybe via audiovisual means, but maintaining social distances. But he needs to be observed by a doctor every day to see if he would develop any other symptoms.
And just looking at the disease generally and kind of tapping into your rather large experience with it, it is possible to test negative, not show symptoms, but still be infectious. So that's a small window, isn't it?
Well, that's a possibility, but it's largely based on maybe the technicalities of getting the sample. Because the sample collection might be flawed, and so it's possible, but it's very mild, very small percentage.
Right. So without being too speculative, I mean, journalists are always accused of being speculative, and you're somebody who's a scientist, so you tend to deal more with the facts. But as a doctor yourself, tell us what you think is likely to happen next. I mean, he's 74 years old, but he's got good medical care. Well,
with being 74 and with good medical care, and then that he had just been a bit obese with no much comorbidities that we know of. Well, considering the statistics that a lot of people with mild disease will recover, he may recover.
Okay, I want to thank you very much indeed, Dr. Cyril Erameh, who's consultant physician and neurologist and works at the This Day Dome COVID Isolation Center in Abuja. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our analysis of the news that President Trump has tested positive for coronavirus. We'll speak to our special correspondent. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Aniagolu. So like the British Prime Minister and the Brazilian President, Donald Trump has become the latest world leader to catch a disease he had previously downplayed. In the TV debate on Tuesday night, he mocked Joe Biden for regularly wearing a mask just hours before he tested positive himself, the president gave a speech to a Catholic charity in which he said the US was getting on top of the virus and that the end of the pandemic was in sight. Well, for the latest, I'm joined now in the studio by Arise Special Correspondent Karl Bostic. Good to see you, Karl. First of all, how is Mr. Trump, and is he still in charge and still running the country?
Well, that's the thing, Charles, because just the reports of the fact that he tested positive just opened up, you could say, almost like a Pandora's box of questions, because the White House physician, he didn't say whether he had any symptoms or not. I mean, so all of a sudden, this raises questions about his health, the stability of the country, and then also just the future of his campaign for re-election. We are now seeing reports that it's being said that he's reported mild symptoms so far, and it's also been reported that Mike Pence, who is vice president, has tested negative so far. But nonetheless, that does not really put to rest a lot of anxiety about just whether or not this could get even worse or could escalate. I just want to return to for a moment about the fact that even though Mike Pence has tested negative, it doesn't mean that everything is still in order for succession. Just to know, because a lot of people are, because the markets are rattled, not only in the U.S., but also around the world.
Absolutely. In
terms of who's in charge. We have a slide to show you very briefly about what that order of succession is. And this is the 25th Amendment in the Constitution. And it does show that the Vice President Mike Pence would be next in line if he does become much more seriously ill, for example, followed by Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi. And then afterwards, according to the Constitution, it would be the President pro tem of the Senate. That means the second highest ranking member of the Senate, who's Charles Grassley. And then fourthly, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. But you'll notice that Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, she's 80 years old. And the President pro tem of the Senate, Charles Grassley, he's 87 years old. So while Mike Pence is declared negative, it's really important to keep them healthy as well.
Absolutely.
So really the problem now is to get to your question, Charles, about, well, how healthy is he? Let's just look at some more information about, how long does it take before we know this could actually escalate further. We have another set of figures to show you from the Centers for Disease Control, which is the major health agency in the U.S. Well, first of all, actually, this from the Centers for Disease Control, they're saying that 40% of people who are exposed to the COVID, they don't really show any symptoms, Charles, until 2 to 14 days after exposure. So we still may not see anything for the coming days, if you will. And then following that, but what about the other 60% who may show symptoms? We have a slide to show you there. 60% who are infected show symptoms ranging from fever, cough, shortness of breath, loss of taste, etc. So even though it's mild symptoms now, it's still really, really early days. And that's why there are quarantine rules in place at the White House, because it's not the first time that staff members have tested positive. And the rules, in a sense, are such that if you test positive and you work at the White House, you go home, you don't work, you stay at home, and you don't come back until at least a week after you've tested negative twice. So what that means for President Trump, Charles, 32 days until the election. Do you think it's going to be easy for him to do nothing and self-isolate in the White House for at least a week until he tests negative twice? That's the conundrum.
No, absolutely. That's a very challenge. That's a very important point, because obviously if he's quarantined for 14 days, that's half the time to the elections, or virtually half the time. But take us through the timeline. Do we know how he might have got the virus? What's the speculation?
Well, this is really what's interesting, Charles, because just separate from the news, the fact that he's been exposed to it, which obviously triggers a whole range of scenarios about what happens next. It's what did he know and when did he know it, all right? And many are suggesting that he knew as early as Wednesday night, because it's not ironclad that his senior aide, Hope Hicks, who travels with him everywhere, might have been responsible, but it was known that she was showing symptoms Wednesday night during the rally in Minnesota. And she tested positive Wednesday night, and they knew it Wednesday night. Nonetheless, Thursday, he still carried on with his activities. He traveled to New Jersey to his Bedminster Golf Club for a meeting with donors. Hundreds of people where he mingled with them, took photos with them, and no one wore masks. So now there's a lot of panic and outrage in New Jersey, where the New Jersey governor is in fact even saying everyone who is in his vicinity and proximity of them needs to be tested. But these are also wealthy donors, because It's almost a height of irresponsibility. If you know someone's been exposed and you could have been exposed, why are you mingling with so many people like
Absolutely.
that? And then finally, Charles, when this news broke, it broke Friday night, the wee hours, just after midnight. It didn't break because the White House wanted to be so forthcoming, Charles. It was another news agency, Bloomberg News. Bloomberg News had called on that Hope Hicks, a senior aide, had tested positive, and that now the President and First Lady were being tested as well, and were awaiting results. Because Bloomberg News went with that report, the White House had no choice. They had to come forward.
Very interesting. And of course, Americans waking up to that shocking news. What's been the reaction in America, generally speaking?
Well, I think people don't want to get into an I told you so mode, because they do want to wish a speedy recovery. He is the leader of the country, and there is so much uncertainty. It's the last thing the country needs right now. I mean, for example, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, his running mate, they both, sent, their thoughts and prayers to the President and First Lady, wishing a speedy recovery. Kamala Harris tested on Thursday. She tested negative. We're waiting for Joe Biden's results later today, I believe. They're supposed to be carrying on with their own campaign today to Michigan and Nevada, respectively, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. So it's a really strange sort of dynamic right now because, for example, as you also pointed out, 32 days left to the election. He's got to self-isolate and quarantine. Really, this kind of puts all campaign stops on ice. The next debate, Charles, is supposed to be October 15th. Do you really think, they want to put him in the same area and space with Joe Biden if he's still recovering or has symptoms and still testing positive? So it's really, if not uncertain, perhaps unlikely that the second debate between President Trump and Joe Biden could even happen.
Although, of course, they could do it virtually. I mean, it wouldn't be the two of them in the same room. They could have, the anchor sitting there and in talking to both of them one after the other.
That's if he's healthy enough.
Absolutely. That's a good point. We'll have to wait and see. And you mentioned Mr. Biden there, and there is still some concern, isn't there, that Mr. Biden and Mr. Trump, how close they got to each other before and after that last debate. That is still unclear, isn't it?
Well, that's why it's important to see what those results are from Joe Biden's test today. I mean, they didn't shake hands. They were further than 6 feet apart. So if anything, some people were outraged. They're outraged at the behavior of President Trump's entourage at that Tuesday event in Cleveland, Ohio, when after they arrived, the family and staff members, they took off their masks despite the entreaties, the pleas from the hosts at the convention center saying, please respect our guidelines, as the rest of the audience is, please put your masks on. And the photos and pictures indicate that the family members had all taken off their masks in that sense. So that's why a lot of people really feel there's a show of irresponsibility, Charles. But again, to get back to one of your earlier questions, because it's a fast-moving situation. Well, yes, Mike Pence has tested negative because he's next in line of succession. People are waiting to see. One of the biggest questions is, are we going to see President Trump today? He's holding a teleconference with senior citizens on coronavirus. But will we see him actually, for example, there's a discussion that he may address the nation tonight or sometime during the day on TV or some other activity to reassure people that he is still in charge and running the government. And that would also be a reassurance to other countries as well.
Sure. And I'll just ask you, we've got about a minute counting down, a question I asked the Democrat we spoke to earlier, which is that how the Biden campaign and the Democrats handle this will be interesting to see, because there's a risk, isn't there, that they could overplay their hand in criticizing the president and get a public backlash, because a lot of people might be viewing the president sympathetically now.
I don't think they can really overplay it, Charles. In fact, probably the less they do is more. So many of these crises that have happened, Charles, have been of his own making. They don't really need to do much. What I'm suggesting is this. One reason why President Trump wanted to get back on the campaign trail, because he's being defined by his handling of the coronavirus pandemic. And now it's come right to the center of the White House. So he's being defined by that, and he's being defined by the fact that he was saying the coronavirus pandemic has gone away, but it hasn't. So he's undermined by that, and voters can see that. There isn't, President Joe Biden doesn't need to say that much to put that in people's minds.
Karl, thank you very much indeed. Karl Bostic, our special correspondent there. That's it for this edition of the Arise interview. Join us again tomorrow from me and the entire team here in Abuja and London and the United States. Bye-bye, and thank you for watching.